Well, hello. Welcome back to another exciting edition of Coffee with Stephen. So, this week's blog is entitled Executive Orders. And as many of you probably already know, President Biden last week issued some potential executive orders involving firearms. And for those of you who are interested, on Wednesday night, the same night that the blog is put out, Major and I are going to be having another drinks and cigars with the Major and the Captain, where we're going to be discussing the actual orders themselves and whether or not there's any constitutional validity to these things. That notwithstanding, I did feel it was important to write a blog where we sort of went over these things. The blog itself gets fairly in depth. What is interesting is that, and the media has been all over President Biden for this. In his opening remarks, essentially stating the justifications for moving forward with this, he completely botched it, right? I mean, said a number of things that were factually untrue, some things that were hyperbole, to say the very least. But even the New York Times called him out for making false statements during his opening remarks. And candidly, when you lose the New York Times during a gun control speech, you've got problems, all right? That notwithstanding, he subsequently turned over the microphone to Attorney General Merrick Garland, and Merrick Garland articulated the 5 different things that the administration is seeking to rectify without using Congress in order to achieve their objectives. Now, they made some statements on how they'd like Congress to pick up the mantle on gun control and create all sorts of legislation and blah, 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 blah. But these were the things that they wanted to tackle instantly, and they felt that they could do so through the use exclusively of the executive branch of government. One of the things that they want to do is create a weapons trafficking database. Now, understand, this sort of already exists. But notwithstanding that, they want to do something even more robust. And if we're looking at this from a nefarious standpoint, perhaps they're looking at doing some form of national gun registration. It's entirely conceivable. It's also fundamentally unworkable. They want to regulate what Merrick Garland refers to as ghost guns. Now, this one's actually kind of interesting. Typically speaking, the general concept of a ghost gun is a firearm that has had no connection to the state, meaning that there's been no registration, there's been no background checks, there's been no NICS, there's nothing, right? And this is because the individual effectively built the firearm from the ground up. Typically speaking, when we talk about these firearms that have been built by an individual, they tend to be 80% lowers, and they're specifically related to AR-15s. Now, there are actually other firearms that can be made out of an 80% billet, but, when the anti-gun people are talking about it, they're typically referring to AR-15s. What's interesting is that the lower receiver, that chunk of metal, has always been sort of the nefarious boogeyman for the anti-gun crowd. Merrick Garland's discussion actually left out the 80% receiver completely. He was more interested in all the Tinker Toy parts that could be affixed to this 80%er. In fact, he was referring to build kits frequently throughout his speech. Well, the build kit are all of the non-registered parts. Think about precursor parts in California. These would be barrels and, trigger groups and springs and all sorts of other innocuous things that can be put into this thing to create a workable firearm. So it'll be interesting to see how that actually manifests. He talks about red flag laws, which, as I mentioned in the blog, is really nothing more than a shifting of liability away from law enforcement onto the private citizen. In any event, there's a plethora of crap that they're looking at doing. I'm not sure whether or not it actually reaches to the threshold of constitutional muster. And that's the interesting part. The question is really going to come down to what the Supreme Court specifically, is willing to do. And, we've all been looking at all of these gun cases that are making their way up to the Supremes. The left has been absolutely terrified of the Supreme Court hearing a gun case because they're concerned that the court is going to articulate that the Second Amendment is in fact a fundamental right and is deserving of strict scrutiny protection. Well, the irony is that the vehicle that might actually get us before the Supreme Court is Biden's own orders. And as I mentioned at the end of the blog, the irony is only Nixon could go to China. So in any event, I really encourage you to read the blog. If you're interested, I encourage you to join us for our Drinks with the Major and the Captain. As always, I want you to train constantly, train consistently, train repetitively, and train with purpose. But above all else, stay safe.